To welcome you to this session, we're going to talk about the intersection between climate, food, and technology. But before we start, you know, we're getting close to lunchtime, right? So we're all thinking about food. And I want you to think about your personal habits when it comes to eating. So I'm going to read some statements, and by rounds of applause, I want you to tell me which one best describes you, okay? So first one is, you eat meat every single day. Okay. You eat meat occasionally. You never eat meat. You are a vegan. You want to stop eating meat and dairy products, but you just can't do it, can't bring yourself. Okay, and finally, the reason that we're here, you think that cutting out meat and dairy is the path to mitigating the climate crisis. Okay, so you can hear that no matter where you are on the spectrum of meat eating and dairy consumption, we all kind of agree that if we can limit the amount of meat and dairy we eat, that is one path to reducing climate emissions, reducing climate emissions, and this is absolutely true. I mean, there's no doubt that eating less meat and less dairy would really help. Did you know that the meat and dairy production, the industry produces 14.5% of the world's greenhouse gases? So that's the same amount as all transportation. So cars, airplanes, ships, and trucks altogether is 14.5. It's the same for the emissions from animal production, from meat and dairy. So, okay, so there's a couple of ways to think about this. So one path would be to convince a critical mass of people to go vegan. And another path would be to farm differently, to raise animals differently, and to do so in a way that actually improves the land and sequesters carbon, and this is called regenerative agriculture. Over the summer, the Biden administration committed $22 billion towards climate-smart farming. And and companies like PepsiCo, Cargill, Walmart, and General Mills are backing this cause. So we're going to get into both of these approaches to eating our way to a better planet. And I'd like to introduce our two guests. This is going to be a great conversation. So first, I'd like to introduce Ethan Brown. He is the founder and CEO of Beyond Meat, and Claudio Núñez, who is the conservation grazing manager at the Santa Lucia Conservancy up in Monterey. So please welcome my guests. Okay, gentlemen, so we are gonna, just a little housekeeping. All of you have questions. If you want to have any, all of you have note cards. So if you want to ask any questions, please write them down. You can hand it to one of our producers, and then we'll be able to get to some of those questions. We'll come to you with a mic, okay? So just feel free to write things down, and we'll try to get to them in the middle of the conversation so that we can all have a conversation together. Okay, so we're going to start, Ethan, we're going to start with you, okay? And let's start with your approach. How much faith do you have that we're going to be able to wean the world off of meat with plant-based alternatives?
Yeah, so I think about this obviously all the time, and one of the frameworks that I use is around the automotive adoption here in the United States. And so if you look at in the 1890s, this notion of being able to replace the horse with the automobile was ridiculed. And the early inventors and entrepreneurs were seen as kind of chasing a fool's errand. This would never happen. And they were working with single-cylinder engines to try to propel what they called the horseless carriage. Now, of course, that all changed, and today, horse-drawn carriages are a novelty in cities, but largely gone. And I think here, in this instance, there's a similar dynamic going on where it seems like it's a bridge too far, but if you take a step back and look at the broader lens of history, this is something that I feel is inevitable. And what we do is we take protein directly from plants. And so instead of running plant material through an animal to create muscle, we use technology to reshape the proteins within plants so they take on the fibrous texture of muscle. That's it. We use something that basically combines heating, cooling, and pressure, so it's a physical process. If protein presents like this in a plant, We're just breaking the bonds and resetting it so it presents like a muscle, which we then recognize as humans as meat. Our job is to drive the taste so it's indistinguishable from animal protein, and we're getting closer. Second is to make sure the health credentials are very well understood. And then third is to drop the price so that it is at parity with animal protein and then ultimately below, which we'll be able to do based on efficiencies. So when you're doing that, there is an incumbent industry that you are threatening, right? And they are doing their very best today to suggest that our process is somehow unhealthy or that our products are full of chemicals. These things are not true. What is true is there is a vast body of literature on the strength of plant-based eating. We're doing our own work with Stanford. We've done a 5-year program with Stanford Medical School. The first program that we did within that initiative was to take people and have them consume 3 servings of animal protein a day, normal amounts of egg and some deli slice or something for lunch, for 8 weeks. And then they had a 1-week washout period. And then they ate Beyond Meat for 8 weeks, same thing, 3 times a day. During the Beyond Meat period, LDL, or bad cholesterol, went down statistically and clinically significant levels, as did TMAO, which is something that's very closely associated with heart disease and certain cancers. So both of those declined during the period we're eating Beyond Meat. Now, if you look at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, the ads that are being taken out against us, they are there to seed confusion in your mind about what's healthy and what's not. And so that is a big headwind for our industry and one that we're going to overcome by being more vocal about the health benefits of our products. The last piece is on climate. So I was in the alternative energy sector. I worked for years in the fuel cell space, and so electric drive and things of that nature, and I love that technology. And I have electric cars myself, and they're terrific. It takes 30,000 miles before you realize the carbon gain on an electric vehicle relative to an internal combustion engine. That's because of all the energy it takes to get lithium ion out of the Earth's surface. So I feel great driving it, but not until 30,000 miles and 1 mile am I making a contribution to climate. You can make a contribution today at lunch, at your breakfast and at your dinner by saying, this is what I stand for. I stand for an inhabitable Earth for my children. I stand for an inhabitable Earth for people who are poor and are going to get absolutely slaughtered by these climate events while the rich retreat. This is what I stand for and I eat. Or you can say, you know what? I feel nostalgic. I feel tradition. I'm going to go ahead and continue to eat what I've been eating. We have a choice, and we have to make the right choice. That's why I started the business, and that's why we're doing what we're doing.
So yeah, on that, you had said actually in the article that David wrote about you for the corner office, you had said that it's actually really hard to get people to change their diets based on climate. It's hard for them to understand. So this is what you're trying to do, and you're trying to explain it to them, right? So
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
Do you think that's changing in people's minds?
I think in this room, I mean,
Yeah.
it clearly is.
Obviously,
you
we
can
have
see
applause
from
for that.
yeah, thank you. I think it's really hard. I mean, I think the consumer is so distracted right now. There's so much stress in the world around just survival, gas prices, inflation, the war in Ukraine, the pandemic, all these things. So it's hard to reach the consumer right now on things that are altruistic, right? Or even for their own health. There's a sense of fatalism almost. And so we have to counter that with hope and things that people can actually do today. And so we're working on that and working on that messaging. But we love data. I love data. This is not a hand-waving activity. So just like we were working with Stanford, we're working with, I hate to say this because I know you went to Michigan and I know there's a...
Go Blue.
Go Blue, right, okay. I'm a Maryland fan. It's very painful. So we did a life cycle analysis with the University of Michigan. Great work that they did. And they looked at the overall impact on climate and the environment of a Beyond Burger versus a 80-20, which is a normal beef burger, right? So again, as you're sitting down at the table and as you're deciding what you're going to eat, here are the statistics that are in my mind. 90% fewer greenhouse gas emissions. 99% less water, which in the West matters. Colorado is drying up, right? Utah, you have to deal with this, right? So your choices make a huge difference. So 99% less water. 93% less land and about less land use and about half the energy use. So the environmental benefits are massive. We just have to figure out how to better communicate that to a distracted consumer.
Right. And so do you feel that focusing on plant-based substitute meat alternatives takes away from all other protein-heavy plant-based products like tofu, quinoa, beans. How do you feel that should the focus be going there instead? I mean, obviously not because you're here, but how do you balance all of that? How should people think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a time, so when I started studying climate in the early 90s, and by the way, my father, I wish he were here because he's in McGill, a professor there, and he would just absolutely go gaga about Diana. It's hard to go on a walk with him because he's been studying climate for so long, and he won't stop picking up acorns. So people who understand this problem understand the urgency. And so, you know, I think just continuing to look at every solution that we can possibly invent, Claudio's solution, my solution, you know, direct consumption of plant-based tofu and things of that nature. But what's happened is there's an insidious and strange sort of bedfellows here where the big ag who is trying to tag our food as processed and elite foodies are kind of coming together, right? And, you know, in Marin and Martha's Vineyard, you might be able to have a backyard hen, right? But the rest of the world eats, you know, confined animals that are being fed antibiotics, are being, you know, in systems that require specialized lighting and require that their meat, once it's been harvested, is actually inspected to make sure there's no arsenic in it, there's no feces in it. It's not a process that we can really get excited about, right? That's what the rest of the world eats.
Yeah.
And so as the foodies say this is less healthy than kale,
Yep.
and the meat industry says this is processed, we lose a real opportunity to actually make fundamental change.
Okay, and so that's a perfect way to start talking to you, Claudio, about what you're doing. So let's talk about regenerative agriculture. There's no one definition in terms of what the government says about what it is. I don't even think there's agreement among farmers about what it is necessarily.
Absolutely true.
So for you, can you explain what regenerative farming is?
Yeah, I mean, I actually agree with just about everything that Ethan just said.
Yep.
And I think that we do get into these really nitpicky arguments, and I think in the regenerative space the same thing has happened. That, you know, Professor Roundtree at Michigan State and professors, you know, at Berkeley or at Texas A&M are all having these fights, and we have to recognize we're all on the same page, first and foremost. Regenerative agriculture is obviously, it's not a defined term legally. I think that people around the country are prioritizing different aspects of their ecology in their farming systems. And then there's also, frankly, a fair degree of charlatanism and people trying to rebrand themselves while not actually changing all that much. So I think it ends up becoming a consumer education issue to have the defined term, or at least an informed consumer who can make those sort of those questions is really important. But we start with the fact that just about half about the American land base is devoted to food production. And it's in a sad state. The idea that we can regenerate something inherently is telling us that we have had a lot of destruction. And so I think about these sort of like the ecological savings account that exists out there, which we, you know, as Europeans coming to this country, came to a really, really fertile place where we've just been able to take withdrawal after withdrawal after withdrawal from our land base. Yep. And at some point, you need to put a contributing factor back in. We need to make a deposit. And so the techniques, we can get into that, they're sort of specific, but also very general things, because as we look across our land bases from the Great Plains and the Midwest to here in California, there's such divergence, ecologically, that the practices are going to have to be divergent as well. There's not sort of a cosmopolitan set of practices that are going to work on every landscape.
Well, right. I mean, for like what Diana was talking about before, it's like we can plant trees, but we're not going to plant trees on grassland where trees don't exist.
Right.
So for you, what we're going to do on that grassland, can you just talk about how raising animals on grassland is a way to sequester carbon and is a way to regenerate that land?
Certainly.
Yeah.
And I can talk specifically about the work that I'm a part of right now at the Santa Lucia Conservancy. So it's a 20,000 acre historic Mexican land grant ranch. So after Mexico separated from Spain, all the missions were secularized and basically given out to wealthy landowners. And they became these ranches. And throughout California, it's almost always the senior water right, water being obviously one of these huge issues. in any given county is like the first land grant ranch. And it's, from an ecological standpoint, this amazing, amazing thing to have these large, continuous swaths of wild area.
Right.
So the Santa Lucia Conservancy is 20,000 acres. Of that, we think we have about 20,000 acres, 5,000 of that is grassland. And grasslands exist in different contexts for different reasons, but here in California specifically, they are disturbance dependent. So we had cultural fires for thousands of years by native peoples who lived here, or we had large quantities of grazing animals who kept these things open. And I think that it's our current understanding of land ownership and habitat fracturing that has actually made it so these things aren't particularly healthy. So in the 30 years since the preserve took away its status as a working cattle ranch and made itself a preserve, what we saw was, in that first initial couple of years, explosions of wildflowers, dominance of pretty amazing plants, and then we started to see this plateau, and then they started to go down. So now we go into places where we haven't had a managed disturbance, in some cases for 30 years, and we have perennial grasses that are shooting up like one single sad sward, no seed production from a plant that obviously needs to do that. And right next to that, since the grazing program was introduced about 8 years ago, by having these sort of managed pulses of disturbance, which grasses and herbaceous forbs, sorry to get a little technical word in there, they're designed through billions of years of natural research and development to have these periodic pulses of disturbance, which sort of clear stuff out and stimulates. And then also, I mean, the really big thing is in a feedlot, we're talking about dung and urine as a toxic commodity that's just getting pushed out into water. In a sort of periodic pulsing, it ends up being powerful, powerful fertilizer. So it's really interesting to kind of look where you have a graze line historically. We sweat our butts off walking up and down the hills and putting in temporary fence. It's so physically demanding, but at the end of the day, when you get to like look at health of plants side by side, it's very, very gratifying.
Okay, we have a question from the audience. Johnny on my right.
Sure. Hi, my question is for Ethan. I wanted to say first, Melissa, your recipe for the spicy shawarma with tahini.
Oh, the
outstanding.
cauliflower
One of my favorites.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
the cauliflower.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So good, so good. I make it all the time. This question's for Ethan, though. When do you see, like, what's the projections for reaching price parity with meat, and how low do you actually think you can get the price?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It'll depend on the species that we're targeting. But something super exciting is happening tomorrow. We're starting our trial with Taco Bell with the steak, and that steak is priced at parity with animal protein. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the consumer reacts. And unfortunately, it's only in one city. It's in Dayton, Ohio. But it hopefully will spread throughout the country. And so that's a really important test for me to see. The product tastes so good, right? It's like a strip steak. It's got like a fatty mouthfeel to it. It's priced the same. And then if we can get the consumer to understand the health benefits and the climate benefits, I think we can make real progress. So when you get into cheaper cuts, it gets harder to get below the price point, but it'll come with volume. We are so small right now. We're serving McDonald's in Europe, for example, in Taiwan and Australia, but we really need to get the type of scale that a United States customer like that would provide. And once we get that, then I think you can start to see our overhead be absorbed by much more throughput, and we'll get close. So I'd set 3 years ago to be able to hit price parity within 5 years. And so the steak is obviously one accomplishment, but we plan to do more and try to get ground beef by the end of the 5-year period, so about 2 more years.
Okay, that's an interesting point, just about price parity. So you're talking about price parity of factory farmed meats and Beyond Meat. But let's talk about price when it comes to, regeneratively raised animals. So right now, this is a huge difference. Do you see a world where that price ever comes down, or do you feel like it's always going to be just the most expensive option? Obviously, for the reasons that you were talking about, like this is hard work, this is land intensive, labor intensive.
Well, yeah, so first I can say that at the place where I currently work, we have no meat production.
Right, no, I
and
know,
so
but
we are
yeah.
literally using animals as a tool for ecological value.
Right.
And so I think that that sort of context, Ethan's absolutely right, that 90+%, 98% or whatever it is, of the meat that's produced in the United States is ecologically degrading, excuse me. But this sort of turns it on its head, where it's not the same sort of cost-benefit analysis when you can start to see benefits through the production, right? And so I think that we could probably sell, 45,000 live weight pounds per year and
Right.
still have the current situation. Like, meat is a byproduct of ecological stewardship in our current context.
Yep.
Having said that, though, I think that we have a really horrible structural problem when it comes to the pricing of food in general. And that's not just meat,
subsidies.
but meat is a multiplier. It's an intensifier of, I think, the entire food system. And that's, I think, what Ethan has been working on, right? We have sort of a commodity corn or peas or soybeans or whatever it is. When you have this giant field of a monocrop, that's an ecological problem. And it's also a social problem because we haven't been paying our farmers. Farmers, I think, have lost money year on year for the past 50 years. Only by them being landowners have you actually been able to maintain that thing. So yeah, I think that price should come up across the board on everything, which would actually lead to price parity for Ethan's product much sooner. But yeah, I think that at this point, you're right, that it's a bougie, chic product. To get the regenerative beef from a verified actual producer. At this point, I think that the market probably won't support this going sort of mainstream. And so the way I've kind of looked at it is, I think it's totally okay to take rich people's money and spend it on R&D.
Yep.
And that's kind of what's happening here, because I don't think that, like I said, there is not a cosmopolitan solution. There's not like a single way that we're going to change farming. And so the idea that you have somebody in the Shenandoah Valley and somebody in Marin County actually working on their specific piece of ground, developing an intimacy in their stewardship, and if they can get somebody to pay $60 a pound for a steak, good on you, man.
Right.
Like, that's a good deal.
So meat
And
becomes,
we all benefit from that.
and so meat becomes a luxury product for the market, and then the byproduct is land that is improved, right?
Well, I would say it goes the other way around, but I also think, again,
Okay,
this is
right.
sort of my projection,
Yeah.
right? I think that every single person is going to do this for a different reason.
Yeah.
So at the Santa Lucia Conservancy, we're going to have meat as a byproduct
Right.
of land stewardship. Knock
Okay.
on wood, y'all.
Yep.
I'm trying to get some steak sold.
Yeah.
If you're a commodity farmer, you probably never get to the idea where you have the double underline.
Yeah.
But I think that there are other places where you could have land stewardship as a byproduct of production.
Okay, so it depends on where your focus is.
Yeah, I want to keep that really open because I think every person is motivated by a different set of standards. And in order to, again, walk up and down the hill when it's 115 degrees or it's 30 degrees and it's blowing freezing rain at you, you have to find your own personal, intimate motivations to do that.
Okay, great. All right, we're going to do some audience questions. We have a lot of audience questions. I love how engaged you all are. This is amazing. So the next one is from Doug, right in the center.
Oh, okay. Yeah, most marketing of the new plant protein foods seem to center on simulating meat. And instead, why not work at promoting maximum plant?
Yeah. My mother always asks me that. She's like, why are you trying to do this? Why don't you just create something that's really delicious for the center of the plate? And I think someday we will do that, and I'm really looking forward to it. I think for me, it's about evolution and just our intimate relationship with meat. I'm not one who says that meat hasn't been really valuable to us as a species. It's actually why we're all able to have these conversations. It was a major step forward in our physiology and our brain power. We actually went from eating mostly vegetation about 2.5 million years ago to consuming more animal protein, and that also saved us when climate changed dramatically. We were able to shift into new ecosystems and consume animals to survive. And our stomach shrank as a result, very significantly, most of us. And our brains took that energy And so our brains went from 600 to about 1,300 cubic centimeters, and this big computer that we have now. And so that, between meat and fire, that really is, anyway, that people who know more about this than I do attribute that. And so there's a familiarity to meat that is so important to us. And so that's why I've been so focused on this. And I don't think I can change through moral argument or through efficiency arguments that behavior, but I think I can more readily change the material at the center of the plate so that it's a piece of meat that people recognize and consume as they would animal protein. And for me, the nomenclature is enormously important. You know, the fake meat stuff is, I think, a derisive comment. You know, we don't call the mobile phone a fake phone. We call it a mobile phone. It's just not a landline, right? And so we have to get around that and embrace this as a plant-based meat that's going to be here for us and for good reason and for the future. But, you know, I just want to make sure that you know, I have absolute, you know, this stuff, everything is needed, you know, and there's an effort to try to pit one against the other. And you guys have not done this at this conference, but we need to do everything we can, and we need to do it as quick as we can. And I think the challenge is the carbon cycle is so out of whack that, you know, there are 100 billion animals in the agricultural system on the Earth's surface. 100 billion. Think about that. We talk about like 8 billion people. There's 100 billion animals, right? And they're all consuming food and respiring carbon. That used to work when trees were ubiquitous, right? But we're doing what? We're chopping down all the trees and putting more animals on this Earth's surface. That just doesn't work. And so, for me, again, it gets a very important social issue too. It's not just about our homes, right? It's the poor are going to be destroyed with these storms. A lot of us here will move up a little bit higher land, right? But the general population in the world will be destroyed. And that's something we have to try to stop. And so 3 times a day, you can try to do something. And that's to make a different choice at the center of your plate.
We have actually a good apropos question from Zoe on my left. Or a comment, I'm not sure. It's a comment or a question, but Zoe, where are you? There you
Question, hi.
Good.
So thank you so much. This panel is fabulous. So the importance of natural and working lands for carbon capture is obvious. And in a lot of cases, grazing is sort of the only thing keeping land from being developed. So I'm wondering, in a future where plant-based meat is dominant, what's going to keep staving off the bulldozers?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Great question.
So
Well,
both of you can
Yeah.
answer that
You wanna go
differently.
first?
Let's,
yeah.
So you know, the climate bill was kind of disappointing to me. I mean, as I mentioned, I was in clean tech, and I spent a lot of time with the Department of Energy there. I first worked on nuclear energy, and then worked on business development in the area of electric drive and fuel cells. I'd go to these conferences, and we'd be literally like wringing our hands about how to get lithium-ion batteries to be X% more efficient, or fuel cells to be X% more dense, and things of that nature. People would break for lunch, and they'd have like a steak. And you know, and so I just, you know, the bill should have contained incentives for farmers to put land back into carbon sequestration. Farmers don't need to be stewards just of food, right? They can be stewards of the land, right? And that's really the history of farming, is how do we take care of the earth, right? And so our farm back east, it was a dairy farm when I was a kid. I didn't grow up there. We grew up in the city, but spent weekends and summers a lot of time there. And on either side, there are people doing what you do. You know, it's a small cattle operations, right? And we have to find a way to take those folks and enlist them in the carbon fight, right? And how do we use their land, right, to capture more carbon? And so I think governments paying farmers to do that is the set-aside program is really the right way to stave off the bulldozer. You know, the other is Tech Corridor in Boston, Silicon Valley, Virginia Tech Corridor. Everyone made a ton of money when we went digital in the economy. The farmer got left out. Economic development up on my farm, prisons. You know, we have to figure out a way to bring innovation back to the farmer. So the irony of us being sort of attacked by the ag industry is that we can bring innovation directly to the field. If you're using 100 acres to grow feed for an animal, you can now generate the same amount of beef, our beef, right, in 7 of those acres. That just gives you 93% more acres to do something with. So let's bring innovation back to the American farmer and make the land more valuable so the bulldozer stays away.
yeah. Which is actually, so the question I had for you is, which you started to answer. Oh wait, but Claudio, you didn't answer that question.
I'm
but
good to
this
go,
is
but
gonna
if you're on a roll, baby,
no, but
go
this
for
is,
it.
No, because this is actually, it's touching on the same things, and I want you both to answer this. So right, so you started to talk about how do we dismantle the factory farm system, right? I mean, you had touched on it a little bit about, government subsidies and getting farmers to farm differently. Because I think we all agree that this is, or certainly you both agree, that this is the way forward, right? And whether you're going to do it through changing your diet in part or changing your diet entirely, but this has to be a major part of how we're going to bring down emissions. So Claudio, can you just talk about like how a vision that you have of
Yeah,
how
I
this
think that becomes a sociological question as
Yeah.
much as anything else. We always have this conversation in this country, and I think in the West at large, about the market will decide, and have this like very Adam Smithy view of like priorities, which is malarkey.
Yeah.
So I'm going to use that word in public. And I mean, it's just not true. And so the preserve that I work for is a thing that only is going to work in California because land value is so high for us to get a $25 million endowment and do it that way. I think it's going to be different in every single place, but I think we do ultimately have to come back to this conversation, and I think this is the core of the regenerative thing. We can get into practice all the way through, but that nature and the natural systems that exist, biological, chemical, they have value, and paving over them is, I mean, I don't know, it's hard to use the word a sin, in public like this, because everybody's got a different set of moralities, but the idea of functioning lands as being, I think the previous presentation was exactly on point on this, we don't know all of the connections that human beings in this context, but we are not like, there's a guy named Timothy Morton who used to be at UC Davis, and he wrote a book called Ecology Without Nature. And the thesis of it basically was that we've been telling ourselves this story, that there's the background of nature, and in the foreground is the human story, the human experience. And that's, again, malarkey is the word that I'll use. There is no foreground, there is no background. We are embedded within a much, much larger system that's interconnected. And everything that we do is kind of going out into the world, and we can talk about altruism, but it comes back to us. And so ultimately, you can also make that from a very personally centered, just looking at your own welfare. I think as we take genetic diversity out of our landscapes, we're hurting ourselves as much as we're hurting anything else.
Absolutely. Okay, we're gonna wrap in a minute, but I just have to let you guys know of a little experiment that we did, and let all of you know about an experiment. We used you as guinea pigs for our own little behavioral science experiment. So when we had all of you register for the lunch, we let you know that the lunch was going to be a vegan lunch unless you opted out, and you could opt out of the vegan lunch. Out of all of you, only 2 of you opted out of the vegan lunch, and we heard how many of you were vegans. So that's actually, so I just wanted to wrap this by saying, by putting this out there, if people have to make an extra effort to get meat, will they eat less of it? Is this a way? And this happened to me on the way here. When I was getting a coffee, I asked for a cappuccino, and they said oat milk, right? And and so is it also just a matter of reframing the question in our mind and reframing the way our relationship to what we're eating? So you have all thank you for participating in our social experiment. We learned something really valuable. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank
this was fantastic.
Great work. Really